Page 366 continued. One Eye, Poetry up to 1914. The decadent conception of poetry, so unhealthy and devitalized, had little hope of long survival, and by 1900 the search for a more natural type of verse has already begun. The chief poets of this period are discussed here. Hardy was one of them. He began as a poet. Though for a long time he was unable to find a publisher for his verse, he continued to write poetry. After the public outcry against his two greatest novels, he wrote only verse. Wessex poems, written between 1865 and 1870, appeared in 1898, and there followed in a steady stream Poems of the Past and Present, 1901, The Dynas, Part 1, 1903, 2, 1906-3, 1908. Time's Laughing Stocks, 1909. Satires of Circumstance, 1914. Moments of Vision and Miscellaneous Verses, 1917. Late Lyrics and Earlier, 1922. Human Shows, Far Fantasies, Songs and Trifles, 1925. Winter Words, 1928. Collected Poems, 1932. If we accept the Dynas, his epic drama of the Napoleonic Wars, cast in a gigantic mold, the bulk of Hardy's verse consists of short lyrics, speedily condensed in expression, often intentionally angular in rhythm, but always showing great technical care and a love of experimentation. As some of the titles suggest, they, like the novels, reveal concern with man's unequal struggle against an overwhelming fate, and if they seldom echo the bitter accusations of his novels, many of them are deeply felt. The Dynas is a great achievement with its 130 scenes and enormous gallery of portraits. In places it seems unduly long, but it has fine dramatic scenes and many warmly human moments. It is the final expression of Hardy's philosophy. Para. But the real sensation in the last decade of the 19th century was undoubtedly the poetry of Rudyard Kipling. It roused some people to wild enthusiasm, others to protest, and it surprised everyone. Deliberately intended to appeal rugged and vulgar, it was a clever combination of the folk song and the music hall chorus, with a command of rhythm worthy of Swinburne. Into this rough mold were poured heroic themes and sentiments. It resounded like a drumbeat or a bugle call among the exquisite, quote, refinements of chamber music, stop, unquote. It progressed like a military march with growing dignity from the barrack room ballads of 1892 to the Seven Seas of 1896 and the Five Nations of 1903. It was the hymn of imperialism taken up by thousands of voices. It contained an entire popular philosophy, a whole national policy. The poems were roughly hammered, sinewy, without delicate graces, but with a powerful and compelling swing. Sometimes the language is pure slang, sometimes it is largely biblical. With these different means, Kipling achieved a volume of effects which made him the English counterpart of the American Walt Whitman. Para. The next important poet of this era was William Butler Yeats, 1865 to 1939. Like so many of his contemporaries, Yeats was acutely conscious of the spiritual barrenness of his age, and his whole artistic career is best seen as an attempt at first to escape from the sordid materialism which he found on every hand, and later to formulate a new positive ideal which would supply his spiritual needs. In the easy charm and delicate, smooth grace of his early work, the influence of the pre-Raphaelites is clearly seen. It has something of the melancholy picturesqueness of that school, but with a mystical, dreamlike quality peculiarly its own. A believer in magic and kindred arts, yet sought to escape into the land of, quote, fairy, F-A-E-R-Y, unquote, comma, and looked for his themes in Irish legend and the simple elemental impulses of man's primitive nature. The best remedy for the emptiness of the present seemed to lie in a return to the simplicity of the past. Page 367. To this period belongs his narrative poem, The Wanderings of Oisin, O-I-S-I-N, 1889, which first established his reputation. Poems 1895, The Wind Among the Reeds, 1899, and The Shadowy Waters, 1900. And it was in these early days that he wrote many of the lyrics whose simplicity of style and melodic beauty have found them a place in numerous collections of modern verse. Probably the best known of them is the Lake Isle of Innisfree, I-N-N-I-S-F-R-E-E, para. It is no exaggeration to describe Yeats as one of the most difficult of modern poets. His preoccupation with the attempt to formulate a philosophical system which could replace the scientific materialism of his age underlies most of his later verse. It is doubtful whether he ever succeeded in crystallizing a completely systematized philosophy and his most comprehensive exposition of his ideas. A Vision 1925 is in many places very obscure. Yeats's philosophy is often expressed through a carefully devised system of symbols, some purely private, others drawn from his study of philosophy or his reading in the works of the French symbolism or of earlier symbolical poets, particularly Blake and Shelley. By means of them, he succeeds in expressing those deep emotional experiences which he felt to be otherwise incapable of poetical communication, but sometimes they serve only to accentuate the obscurity of his poems. The reader's difficulties arise mainly from Yeats's use of the same symbol to represent a variety of things. Thus, the tower may represent, among other things, an intellectual refuge or the soul's yearning for the world of the spirit. Other of his well-known symbols are moon, the swan, and Byzantium. Para. Robert Bridges was another poet of this period. In 1929, he published his long philosophical poem, The Testament of Beauty, an attempt to show beauty as the supreme force in life and to trace man's growth to perfect wisdom. He draws upon almost every field of knowledge, and the poem, over lengthy and digressive, suffers from its unorthodox spellings and an unusual laxity in matters of technique. However, it contains many fine passages and, in spite of its weaknesses, stands high among English philosophical poems of the grand scale. His poetry is seldom concerned with the sterner issues of life, and then not usually with success. The beauties of nature, the charm of landscape, in particular the joy and romance of love, memories of an almost idyllic childhood, these are the themes which he treated with the good breeding and absence of passion demanded of a gentleman. Para. John Mesfield made great contributions to the Georgian poetry. His first poetry was in the vein of Kipling, the poetry of action and adventure, but with a Chaucerian breadth of humanity. Saltwater Ballads 1902 began the long line of sea poems on which much of his popularity still rests. Written from first-hand experience, they blend a sense of the romance and beauty of the sea with a thorough knowledge of seamen. Ballads and Poems 1919 shows developing technical skill, but The Everlasting Mercy 1911 marks a new epoch in his writing. The violent, often crude realism of this poem in octosyllabic couplets, which deals with the affairs of the drink-sodden Saul, S-A-U-L, Kane, K-A-N-E, and the life of country taverns, is a deliberately shocking protest against the anemia which afflicted contemporary poetry. It was followed in similar vein by The Widow in the By Street, B-Y-E 1912, The Daffodil Fields 1913, and Lollingdon, L-L-I-N-G-D-O-N, Downs 1917. Dabber, D-A-U-B-E-R 1913, written under the same impulse, combines with its realism. Many fine passages which catch the wonder and magic of the sea, while his best narrative poems, Reynard the Fox 1919 and Right Royal 1920, though vigorously realistic, are more natural in tone and show his love for country life, which appears later in the warm beauty of The Land Workers 1943, which gives excellent pictures of the rural England of his youth. Of his other collections of verse, mention may be made of Midsummer Night 1928, Collected Poems 1932, End and Beginning 1934, and Wanderings. Stop para. De la Mare began as a writer for children, and a certain naive, childlike simplicity which appeared in his early work has established itself as one of his most distinctive qualities. A true Georgian, he has rarely found his inspiration in the burning problems of modern life, preferring to concentrate on romance and nature as his main themes. These he has handled with an artistry which has won from moonlight quietness and mystery a magic peculiarly his own. Many of his poems have an elfish humor which is quite unmistakable. The Listeners and Other Poems 1912 and Peacock Pie 1913 have this translucent quality, but as he matures, he occasionally sounds a more powerful note. Page 368. But even during the two great wars of this century, he has remained for the most part aloof from the politico-social problems which have vexed the souls of his younger contemporaries. The Fleeting and Other Poems 1933, Bells and Grass 1941, Collected Poems 1942, The Burning Glass and Other Poems 1945, and The Traveller 1946, to mention some of the most notable of his volumes, embody the same love of nature. The elusive dreamlike quality, the simplicity which is the product of consummate artistry, and the technical ability which has enabled him to turn to the use of the modern writer the traditional forms of English poetry. Para. Few modern poets have been more deeply rooted in the central tradition in English poetry than Edmund Blunden. He is primarily a pastoral poet seeking inspiration in the sights, sounds and smells of the English countryside, subjects which he has handled with a Shelleyan lucidity and a technical subtlety which has yet allowed the authentic rural spirit to shine through his verse. A prolific writer, he first came to notice as contributor to the later volumes of Georgian poetry, and his popularity has remained unimpaired, even though later opinion has reacted against the Georgian school as a whole. As can be seen in some of his more horrific war poems, his experience in the First World War was not without its effect on his verse, but the impact was not sufficient to make any radical change in the nature of his art. His interest in the peace and beauty of nature, the accuracy of his observation, his delight in delicate rhythms, and that fondness for archaisms which aroused the interest of Robert Bridges in Blunden's earliest work, all are still to be found in Shells, S-H-E-L-L-S, by a stream, Shells by a Stream, 1944, which contain many of his finest lyrics. Para. The poetry of A.E. Housman, Housman, has close affinities of mood with that of the poets of the end of the 19th century, and even more markedly with the writings of Hardy. His poetical output was small, consisting entirely of 3 slender volumes. A Shropshire Lad, 1896, on which his reputation mainly rests, Last Poems, 1922, and the posthumously published More Poems, 1936. Yet his popularity and influence have been out of all proportion to the slender bulk of his verse. A Shropshire Lad is a series of 63 poems set for the most part in the country of the Welsh border, of which Hughesman is the prophet, as Hardy is of Wessex. The predominant mood in one of cultured, ironical disillusionment with life, though the poet's appreciation of natural beauty is everywhere to be felt. Tragic in tone, often to the point of morbidity, the poems have the polished ease and restraint which might be expected of so fine a classical scholar. They are concise, sometimes epigrammatic in expression, yet always perfectly easy to understand, and the emotion is handled with a sureness of touch which never mars an effect by overemphasis. His 2 later volumes are written in the same mood and reveal the same high qualities of craftsmanship. The Name and Nature of Poetry, 1933, his one critical work on English literature, is a brief exposition of his own views upon his art. Para. W. H. Davis's first-hand experience of tramps and DOSS-houses is turned to account in his poetry, but on these subjects his work lacks the fibre of the truly great and is often marred by flaws of taste. His reputation rests mainly on those short pieces in which, with something of the simplicity of Wordsworth's lyrics, he expresses his obvious enjoyment of natural beauty. Unlike Wordsworth, however, he rarely goes below surface impressions in search of a deeper significance. His is mainly a pictorial art, modestly capturing the fleeting impressions of the senses in a direct, simple and unpretentious style. The result is occasionally banal but often charming, and the reader is constantly surprised by a striking felicity of image. His love poems have the same qualities as his nature lyrics. Among his volumes of verse are The Soul's Destroyer and Other Poems, 1905, New Poems, 1907, Collected Poems, 1916, 1928, 1934, and Love Poems. Para. Lascelles Abercrombie was one of the original contributors to Georgian poetry, and though his work reflected at various times his interest in nearly all the major writers from Tennyson to Bridges, his greatest enthusiasm was for the blend of the emotional and intellectual which he found in the poets of the metaphysical school. He searched many out-of-the-way fields for subjects suitable for treatment in the metaphysical manner, and as a result his studies of spiritual conflict are often unconvincing. But he was a considerable metrical artist with a fine rhythmic sense, and he frequently surprised the reader with a striking image and the splendour and vigour of his writing. Page 369. He is much at home in a compressed and somewhat angular blank verse, and has a particular fondness for the dramatic monologue. He had not the qualities to make him either truly great or widely popular, and it is perhaps significant that we find him devoting most of the last 20 years of his life mainly to literary criticism. His main publication were Interludes and Poems, 1908, Emblems of Love designed in several discourses, 1912, Thomas Hardy, 1912, An Essay Towards a Theory of Art, 1922, The Idea of Great Poetry, 1925, Romanticism, 1926, Collected Poems, 1930, Poetry, Its Music and Its Meaning. 3i Para, The Poets of the 1914-18 War. The First World War brought to public notice many poets, particularly among men in the armed forces, while it provided a new source of inspiration for writers of established reputation. Not a few of the younger poets were killed or died in the struggle, and it is impossible to estimate the loss sustained by English poetry in their deaths. Three of the most significant of the new poets are dealt with in some detail. Among the others, mention must be made of Julian Grenfell, C.H. Sorley, S-O-R-L-E-Y, Robert Nichols, Robert Graves, Edmund Blundell and Lawrence Binyon, B-I-N-Y-O-N. A representative selection of the work of poets of this war will be found in Anthology of War Poetry, edited by Robert Nichols and published in 1943. Para. There can be no clearer reflection of the changing national attitude toward the conflict as the weary years brought disillusionment than that found in the poetry of these men. Broadly, two phases may be distinguished. The first was one of patriotic fervor, almost of rejoicing in the opportunity of self-sacrifice in the cause of human freedom, and a revival of the romantic conception of the knight, K-N-I-G-H-T, at arms. Many writers indeed lived and served throughout the war and preserved unblemished this fervor of the early years. But as the carnage grew more appalling and the end seemed as distant as ever, other poets arose with the declared intention of shattering this illusion of the splendor of war by a frankly realistic picture of the suffering, brutality, squalor, and futility of the struggle. The work of this last group, though at first greeted with derision or angry protest, has probably withstood the passage of time better than that of the earlier. Perhaps something of its realism and its depth of understanding has found an echo in the experience of disillusioned post-war generations. The chief war poets are mentioned below. A. Robert Brooke. Though his war poetry is small in bulk, Brooke is usually considered typical of the early group of war poets, perhaps because of his sonnet, quote, "If I should die, think only this of me, unquote," has appeared in so many anthologies of 20th century verse. Brooke's poetry is essentially that of a young, cultured man of leisure. His earliest work betrays something of the affected cynicism of the dissidents, but after a brief and not very successful excursion into the fields of cruder realism, he turned to nature and simple pleasures as his chief inspirations. On these and themes of similar simplicity, Brooke wrote with a youthful, healthy joy in life, a subtlety of observation, and an appreciation of natural beauty, which found for his work a ready place in Georgian poetry. Like Davies, however, he seldom delved below external appearance, and the thought underlying his work usually lacks depth and originality. The ease and limpid simplicity of his verse, partly the result of considerable metrical skill, are eminently suited to his subjects. A reputation partly deserved but probably exaggerated for sentimentality and the reaction against his attitude to war have resulted in a sharp decline in his once great popularity. But his faults were largely those of youth, and his qualities suggest that he had considerable potentialities. Para. His poetry was published in Poems 1911, 1914 and Other Poems 1915, and Collected Poems 1918. His one critical work, John Webster and the Elizabethan Drama 1916, indicates a real appreciation of the dramatist and his period. Letters from America 1916 is his other prose work. B. Siegfried, Siegfried, Sassoon, Sassoon. Siegfried Sassoon may be said to base nearly all his most worthwhile work on his experiences in the war. He saw infantry service in Western Europe and Palestine and was decorated for gallantry. First-hand knowledge of the conditions of trench warfare produced in him a bitter disillusionment, a brief period as a conscientious objector, and above all a determination to shock the people at home into a realization of the ghastly truth. Counterattack 1918, a collection of violent, embittered poems, confirmed the notoriety which had rapidly grown out of his occasional writings for periodicals, page 370, and it is still the best known of his collection of poetry. With a studied bluntness and often provocative coarseness of language, Sassoon painted the horrors of life and death in the trenches, dugouts, and hospitals. And a merciless and calculated realism gave to his work a vitality not previously found in our war poetry. Some critics have found his horrors mechanical or exaggerated, but he still maintains his reputation among readers of poetry. Should that eventually decline, to his credit will always remain the fact that his was the work to inspire the greatest of all the war poets, Wilfred Owen, Owen. In a similar vein to Counterattack, though less successful, were War Poems 1919 and Satirical Poems 1926, but his more recent volumes, The Heart's Journey 1928 and Vigils 1935, are more concerned with attempts to capture for his reader momentary impressions of beauty. Collected Poems was published in 1947. C. Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen was the greatest of the war poets. As early as in 1910, Owen was writing verse in the romantic tradition of Keats and Tennyson, and the influence of French poetry, the product of his stay in France, was never completely shaken off. But the work by which he lives was all produced after his meeting in 1917 with Sassoon. His experience of the trench had brought him rapidly to maturity, and Sassoon set his feet on the path which he himself had already taken. With a frank realism free from the violent bitterness of so much of Sassoon's poetry, Owen set out to present the whole reality of war, the boredom, the hopelessness, the futility, the horror, occasionally the courage and self-sacrifice, but above all the pity of it. He himself wrote, quote, "I am not concerned with poetry. Stop. My subject is war, comma, and the pity of war. Stop. The poetry is in the pity, stop, unquote. And never has the pity of war has been more deeply felt or more powerfully shown. Though his satire is often sharp, he never loses his artistic poise, and his most bitter work has a dignity which is truly great." The Poems of Wilfred Owen, 1931, is a much more complete collection of his works and contains an excellent memoir by Edmund Blunden.